Talofa lava, this is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific. I'm Susana Suisuki. Coming up, Vanuatu's former Prime Minister speaks out ahead of the country's referendum. Also,
I feel that this $10,000 allocation is definitely not enough to push the initiative that we need.
There's criticism over Fiji government's lack of funding to address human trafficking, and a new study challenges the current assumption of Tonga's volcanic eruption. The former Vanuatu Prime Minister and now opposition leader has admitted he has regrets about how he came into power. Ishmael Kausakau was elected in November 2022 after a motion of no confidence was filed against the then Prime Minister Bob Loughman. There has been a trail of no confidence motions filed since then. Ishmael Kausakau spoke with Lydia Lewis about Vanuatu's upcoming referendum, which aims to overcome the nation's persistent political instability. Lydia started off by asking why he's calling for the referendum to be deferred until next year, when he himself is voting yes.
I'm just asking for the government to be considerate about people being aware of their constitutional rights, because the bone of contention at the moment is about members of parliament's movements inside the House. What is at stake at the moment is a move to restrict rights on the basis of people being informed prior to taking that vote.
Simply as you can, what does a vote yes and a vote no mean?
A vote yes, in accordance with Article 17A, requires that a member of parliament voted who is a member of a political party remains with that political party until the end of that period of election. And if he was contemplating a defection or a vote of no confidence in the incumbent leadership, or any confidence issues with respect to the party that he or she is a member, if they do that before the end of the 4-year term, then they lose the seat as members of parliament. As far as Article 17B is concerned, it focuses on pressure groups, independent candidates who enter parliament. Immediately after their election, they have to affiliate with an existing political party and remain thereat until the end of the 4-year period. If at any given time they should choose to support or not support that political party, or embark on a route that is not the same as the route that is to be taken by that political party, then automatically that person loses their seat and it is returned to the people to elect a new member of parliament.
Just to give some context here, you're talking about a 4-year term. In the last 4 years alone, how many prime ministers have there been? And you were one of them.
Yes. What is the real issue here? Is it about dissatisfaction within groupings, or is it decisions taken through motives by members within a group, or what is it? People need to know what the root cause of instability is. And since 1980 to date, it's always been about power struggles.
So what would you like to see then?
You know, I've been walking around Vanuatu, and just in my constituency, the people are armed with very plausible solutions as to how we can address instability without having to rely on an amendment to the Constitution that affects their rights. Things like requiring under the Constitution that you can't be a Prime Minister for more than 2 terms, requiring in the constitutions of political parties that you can't be a president or a member of executive for more than 2 terms. Those sorts of changes that will enable stability to prevail where it hasn't been able to today. There will be some contention by some people who will be affected. They have recourse to their rights. They can go and deal with it then.
What do you mean by that?
Well, a person who's not satisfied by what's happening can go to the Supreme Court and have a determination as to whether their rights will likely be infringed by this amendment.
Is that something you are contemplating doing or speaking with party members about?
At the moment, I'm asking for more time. I am hoping that wisdom prevails at the end of the day.
In reflection on your time as Prime Minister and how you came into that role, do you have any regrets about how that grouping went about it?
Yes, I was so focused about trying to change the country, improving Vanuatu's image. I it was inadvertence on my part, I believe. I just didn't look over my shoulder to see what was happening behind my back. I've learnt my lesson. It's not going to happen again. I will not close my eyes, even when I'm dealing with a nation or what's happening behind my back.
What is your response to the government saying that the referendum cannot be postponed because the process is already underway?
Well, because it's become a political issue now. Because you've got instead of the Electoral Commission approaching the people with this referendum, you've got politicians standing up, state ministers who belong to political parties who rank way up in the system, and it's become a political issue for them. If there is nothing to be gained by shoving a cup of tea down a person's throat. It needs to be offered on a plate, on a saucer. Do you take sugar with your tea? Do you need milk or not with it? Instead of what's happening at the moment.
So public consultation?
Public consultation, which means more time.
A human rights lawyer says children are going missing every week in Fiji and demands the government take notice of what's happening under their nose. There's been widespread criticism over the lack of funding towards addressing human trafficking, with only 10,000 Fijian dollars set by the previous government. The call comes fresh off the heels of a US Department of State report on human rights practices globally, highlighting Fiji's issue of child sex tourism. Alicia Foon has the details.
Fiji has long been a harbour for trafficking drugs, but human rights lawyer Susan Serukai says trafficking people is also happening under the radar.
Drugs and human trafficking go hand in hand. It's one of the biggest running businesses in the whole world, drugs and human trafficking.
Since 2021, only $10,000 annually was allocated to fund a human trafficking unit made up of 2 officers who work alongside Fiji Immigration. Serukai says the allocated funding is nowhere near enough.
I feel that this $10,000 allocation is definitely not enough to push the initiative that we need for tackling human trafficking in our country.
She says children in Fiji are going missing on a weekly basis. A report released by the US government this week reinforces the issue by highlighting dozens of cases where traffickers exploit high school-aged children, as well as homeless and unemployed youth in sex trafficking.
There needs to be a widespread of advocacy on forced labor, forced migration, harboring, human smuggling, and I feel like we still fall short of that. There is a huge gap in the system, and that needs to be sorted. There needs to be training programs, curricula with police officers, public prosecutors, the judiciary.
In a statement, Fiji's Director of Public Prosecutions, Christopher Pride, says domestic trafficking was the most predominant type of trafficking in Fiji. Between 2023 to 2024, he says there's been 3 successful prosecutions, including one case where a Nesori couple were convicted and sentenced for trafficking their daughter for sex to a European male. Another international trafficking case involved a Fijian local who trafficked 6 Bangladeshi nationals into Fiji on the pretext of a better life in Australia. Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance Biman Prasad admits the issue has been neglected and blamed the previous government. He agreed to providing more funding in the next budget come July.
Of course, we will be providing adequate funding, and which means more than what was there. We will make sure that there are adequate resources, and we will be working with our international partners, including New Zealand, Australia.
Serukai says there needs to be a national campaign to raise awareness to educate Fijians on the issue.
It is happening in our country, but the thing is that everyone's overlooked it. Everyone needs to step back. The lack of advocating on how to identify a red flag that, okay, someone's being trafficked into for labor, for sex.
The Women's Crisis Centre in Fiji were referenced in the latest US government report on human trafficking, but its director Shamima Ali declined to be interviewed, saying domestic violence was a more pressing issue for the women's group. Serukai says this response is an example of how most NGOs are swamped and are having to pick their battles. She says the Fiji government must take action and stay true to their word.
The cyclone season in the South Pacific, which came to an end on Tuesday this week, finished with less cyclones than what was forecast. The El Niño weather pattern was supposed to result in a high number of cyclones in the Pacific. However, there were only 7, 2 less than the long-term average. Meteorologist Ben Knoll with New Zealand's National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research told Caleb Fotheringham this El Niño episode was unusual, both on a global and regional scale.
Some of the things that were experienced in terms of weather and climate in the Pacific Islands may not have matched what those islands would have historically expected or experienced in some of those bigger El Nino events in the past. So typically what we've seen in the past is a higher number of cyclone count in the region, tropical cyclones, and the long-term average is about 9. And this year, there's been in the South Pacific, there's been about 7, and then there's been 2 more in the Gulf of Carpentaria, which is on the far kind of western fringe of the region. So overall, it was kind of a season that featured near normal to even slightly below normal amounts of cyclone activity, which definitely went against the grain of some of those past El Nino events. And recently, I was in Fiji at the Pacific Islands Climate Outlook Forum. It's an outlook and a look back where some of the regional partners like NIWA and the Bureau of Meteorology and NOAA get together to work with the Met Services on what has happened in terms of recent weather and what is likely to happen looking ahead. And I can say that a lot of the Met Services, it seems like, experienced on a national level impacts from this El Nino event that may have been a little bit out of kilter with of what they've experienced during El Niños in the past. So I definitely think this El Nino we experienced is kind of cut from a different cloth, and part of the role, I guess, of a meteorologist or someone in climate scientists is to kind of dissect that and understand why.
I remember at the start of the cyclone season, actually before, we had that huge cyclone in October, and that seemed quite unusual. Was that aligned with El Nino?
Yeah, and what was interesting is that the early kind of portion of the wet season in the Pacific Islands probably was most aligned with El Nino, so that kind of September through maybe December timeframe. And it isn't totally out of the ordinary to actually get some early cyclone season activity in the Pacific Islands during El Nino events, but this past year kind of took it to a whole new level where we had the first 3 tropical cyclones to form were all severe tropical cyclones. We had the earliest Cat 5, tropical cyclone on record in October. So there were definitely signs that things were going to be, off to the races, and it was going to be quite a marathon in terms of cyclone season. But then we hit the new year, and there were some unique characteristics, I think, in both the ocean and atmosphere that really prevented the El Nino from really taking off and producing more and more tropical cyclones.
Another thing with El Nino that was expected was some very dry weather in certain countries. Did we see that?
Yeah, so the El Nino certainly did produce some dryness and drought. And in fact, we did run a bit of a survey at the aforementioned Climate Outlook Forum in the Pacific just last week. And drought was actually one of the highlighted words that the Met Services kind of brought up quite a bit. So indeed, there were some countries that experienced dryness and drought. I think parts of Micronesia in particular experienced drought, but there were then some countries that were anticipating perhaps a higher level of dryness or drought where that didn't end up necessarily eventuating. So There were, certainly some negative impacts as well along the equator. We had flooding issues around Kiribati. Some of the equatorial groups that are really close to the equator experiencing high levels of rainfall, flooding. There were a couple of storm surge events as well, and that could be tied to some of the higher sea levels that were experienced during El Nino. So I don't think drought was as profound and widespread as what we've seen in the past. I think that's probably the overarching statement there.
And Kiribati, they were actually expecting rain, so they kind of got what they were expecting, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, right along the equator, I would say the impacts were pretty consistent with an El Nino, and that was above normal rainfall, some higher sea levels, so the likes of Tuvalu, for example, they had some really heavy rainfall early in the year, and that again, that was tied to El Nino. So, what you probably would have seen is that while there are some negatives there around some heavy rainfall and flooding and impacts, what those countries did do is probably, alleviate some of the long-term dryness that was associated with the previous 3 episodes of La Nina. So, although too much rain too fast isn't a good thing, a lot of those countries did see some relief as well, and I guess they're kind of preparing themselves for a possible another La Nina later this year. So that rainfall they would have received probably is important actually toward having long-term water availability in some of those islands.
When do you expect El Nino to leave completely?
Yeah, so we're on the tail end of this El Nino event now. Some of the indicators are already suggesting it's over. A few are just hanging on by a thread. But I would say by the end of May, I think at that point we'll probably be well and truly into what we call ENSO neutral. As we go through the rest of the year, the Pacific is in a state of flux. And the warm water that was once pretty widespread with El Nino, at least at the equator, that is going to be likely replaced by cooler conditions, initially in the eastern Pacific, closer to South America, but maybe by mid to late year, spreading westward and into the central Pacific and affecting parts of northern French Polynesia and Kiribati, as we may go to another La Nina later this year. So right now, I think the Met Services are starting to think about some of the climate patterns that they may experience later in the year should that transition occur.
A newly published study in the International Journal of Volcanology and Geothermal Research suggests Tonga's 2022 volcanic eruption was caused by gas-driven climatic explosion rather than a phreatomagmatic one, where magma and water react violently through the water column. The study describes how the formation of a gas seal led to a 58-kilometre high ash plume and a crater that's deeper than the Burj Khalifa Tower in Dubai. The eruption spread shock waves that almost engulfed the entire planet. I spoke with principal scientist and one of the authors of the study, Cornel de Ronde from GNS Science.
What we feel we've done by incorporating all the information that's been gathered by satellites for the first time with one of these very large eruptions, plus other lines of evidence that suggest that this eruption was gas-driven. So there was a lot of highly compressed gases that exploded out of the volcano, as opposed to any seawater getting in and mixing with the top of a magma chamber.
What made you, as well as the other authors, look into the eruption?
What initially kicked it off for us was that we were part of an uncrewed surface vessel survey of the volcano immediately after it had erupted. Well, in fact, a few months afterwards by the British. And this was a vessel that was driven out of Tonga, and we could map the sea floor. So we mapped the volcano after it erupted, and what we noticed was this beautiful cone shape of the crater, and there was no evidence of collapse of the sides of the volcano. There was no evidence of collapse in the center of the volcano, but rather it looked like just a complete explosion of material having been erupted out of the center of the volcano.
Why does it matter to you to challenge the current assumptions of what caused the eruption?
That's a good question, and because we feel that this type of mechanism of gas expanding and a gas-driven eruption is potentially a lot more dangerous than, for example, when people talk about a coolant magma interaction or seawater, say, interacting with hot magma. And it also can apply to volcanoes that are not necessarily submarine. It can apply to any volcano as long as there's a big gas buildup inside the interior of the volcano, and that becomes sealed, and then if that is breached, you have this highly compressed gas that can erupt in one fell swoop, and it's sort of it's like a runaway train. It just goes further and further down into the volcano, releasing more highly compressed gas, and it just gets bigger and bigger until you exhaust that. So potentially a lot more dangerous volcano for people to look out for.
I understand there will be a voyage to the Hunga volcano. How long will this investigation be carried out while there?
We're going for a month, and it takes us about 5 days to get there from Tauranga and a week to get back to Wellington. So not quite half the time, but between a third and half the time is just getting there. And once we're there, we will do some seismic surveying, so that's to look at the interior of the volcano or the architecture of the volcano. We'll do gravity and magnetic surveys, which tell us a bit about the thickness of sediments that may have infilled the volcano after eruption and where the top of the magma chamber may be. We'll also remap the whole volcano to see if there's any changes in the seafloor, or in fact even if there's small little cones growing back up in the centre of the crater possibly. And we'll look at things in the water column, so that tells us about what hydrothermal systems may have since been created, if you like, since the eruption, and what is actually going down on the seafloor. So it's a multifaceted research cruise with 6 or 7 different elements being done during the course of those couple of weeks at Hunga.
So after being there for a month, from there, what are you hoping to do with the study? I mean, how will this help the local Tongan community?
What we're hoping that it will give us better insight and proof or otherwise of the mechanism that we suggested occurred, causing this very violent eruption. So at the end of the day, it's really trying to understand why and how these volcanoes erupt so violently compared to other eruptions that you see around the world. And if we do have a better understanding of that, perhaps we can make the local Tongan community and any community around the Circum-Pacific region more resilient to these possible types of eruptions, or at least they are aware of them, and that could help them in terms of how they prepare for emergency situations.
That's Pacific Waves for today. To listen back, head over to rnzi.com/programs. We're also on Spotify, Apple and iHeartRadio. From myself and the RNZ Pacific team, Tō whā sui fua.